Welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed.
I'm your co-host, Joe.
And this week we are here with Dan Kremens. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Nailed it.
Cool. Awesome. Welcome, Dan. Dan is a former PE investor and CEO, current PE advisor. He's author of Winning Moves, and he's also the founder of Accelera. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Accelera.
Yep. Awesome.
Accelera.
Welcome, Dan. Why don't we start by just having you tell our audience a little bit about, your background and history, and we can just start there.
Yeah. So Cincinnati and born and raised. I say that only so Omeed and I can bond over Skyline Chili and Graders maybe later in the conversation. I'm a proud Cincinnati Bearcat, did my undergrad there, got my career started here in Cincinnati. Worlds are about as far away from SaaS as you can get. So I had some early operations management responsibilities in a small privately held company here in Cincinnati. Spent some time in investment research for a regional wealth manager here in town, and ended up finding my way into private equity back in 2007, I think it was. And to make a long, private equity history short, I've over the last, whatever it's been, 15 years or so in and around the space, I've done a bunch of different things. I've done deals, I've sourced deals, I've sat on the board of companies we've owned, I've stood up a lot of portfolio support capabilities within a fund. I've led businesses, PE-backed businesses, done a decent amount in SaaS. A lot of businesses are becoming SaaS nowadays, so increasingly my work is sort of overweighted towards SaaS and technology broadly. I'm by no means a technical expert by background, but have seen the SaaS movie from a few different vantage points, certainly as an investor, a little bit as an operator. A few businesses I've been involved in sort of started to pivot towards traditional software and SaaS, and now as an advisor to investors in software companies.
Great. Yeah. So as an advisor to these companies, what is it? Talk to us a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah. So there's lots of, private equity, quote unquote, private equity advisors out there. So it's probably useful to describe what sort of sleeve of private equity advisory I fill. Let me take it back a little bit into my career to sort of explain what I'm doing today. My last firm, we realized that somewhere along our own maturation as a firm, we realized that we're really not in the capital allocation game. Capital allocation, deal making is important. Making thoughtful investment decisions is obviously important to being an investor. But we reframed everything about our business through the lens of we're really in the people game. We're in the talent allocation game. So this realization came to bear at our firm probably in the early 2010s, and we committed a lot of the next 10 years of developing and building the firm towards how do we get really good at the talent elements of the private equity game? Working with, learning from, supporting, partnering with, developing exceptional talent. So my jam as both a private equity guy and as an operator, my major became how do you apply talent to make value creation happen in these companies? So flash forward to today. So I've had a bunch of experience as both a private equity professional and as an operator around that topic of how do you build great teams? How do you develop people within those teams? How do you make sure those teams are aligned both within themselves, with their board, their investors? And so as I spun out of private equity about 2 years ago to start my own thing, it was really around bringing some of the practices that worked for me and worked for us around pre-closing leadership and talent diligence, post-closing, leadership board alignment, executive assessment, talent strategy, talent coaching, productizing those things, bringing them to private equity firms that recognize that talent's important, but may not have the machinery built in their firm or their portfolio companies to actualize that.
That makes a lot of sense. What specifically, if there was an event, or it sounds like it was just an accumulation of experience that led you guys to that change in approach, or was it more of a thing that it evolved over time?
There wasn't a seminal moment per se, but there was a period of time. There may have been some seminal moments or formative moments within this period of time, but I remember this takes us back to probably 2010 or so.
Okay.
The firm I was with at the time, Alpine Investors is the name of the firm. They've gone on to do some really cool, innovative stuff in the way of, people-driven private equity. I think the kernel at the time was probably 2010 or so, we were just coming out of, or maybe in the midst of the global recession. I don't know if you guys have heard about that or not. And what's the old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste or something?
Yeah.
I mean, we're sitting there in the global recession. There wasn't a lot of deal activity happening. We were spending a lot of time, I personally was spending a lot of time on the portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
But our founder, to his credit, had the foresight to say, let's take advantage of this crisis to take a big step back and figure out what has gotten us here and what's going to get us there. So we define what does there look like, long-term vision as a firm, and what do we need to do to move in that direction. In the process of doing all of this, being private equity nerds, we looked at some of the attribution analysis of what has allowed us to be successful today, where have we won, where have we lost, all that sort of thing. And one of the things that became apparent through analysis and just anecdote and lived experience was when we have been intentional about talent and people. I'm going to use that sort of generically, but when we've been intentional about what's the strategy of the business, how are we bringing the right talent to bear to actualize that strategy, making thoughtful, high quality decisions about the talent we're bringing in. When we've done that, we've tended to be more successful than when we have been reactive or haphazard about that. So that was the light bulb to say, well, okay, the first 10 years of this firm's history, we've gotten really good at the deal-making part. What if we dedicate the next 10 years to getting really good at the people part? Knowing that we have an emerging base of proof points that would suggest if we can do that, that can be a winning recipe in a private equity space that hasn't always thought about their business in that way.
Sure. And I know some do and some don't. And that's very insightful, though. I see, and it makes a lot of sense that a recession hits and you need to take stock. You need to think things through carefully. And during that process, that some good insights came out. So that makes sense.
No doubt.
Omeed, you were kind of guiding us on the question there. So let me throw it back to you.
Yeah. And I mean, it also makes sense that, people should be a primary focus. I mean, when a PE firm acquires a company, they're going to be looking to kind of ratchet it up and, really turn on the profits in a big way. So focusing on people is kind of a common, an easy way to do that. I mean, everyone knows that business is all about the people. It's the team that really, that delivers the results. So talk to us a little bit about what that looks like. What does that process look like for you?
Yeah, and I want to hook into something you said. I think it's worth acknowledging at the outset that there is pretty broad recognition among smart private equity people and operators alike that people are important. You don't have to go get an MBA to understand that fundamentally these businesses are just people, as we used to say, people working with other people, doing stuff for more people. What I have observed in the private equity space, and this is changing, this is slowly shifting. Some firms are out farther ahead than others. What I've observed is sort of a knowing doing gap where a lot of people know that talent is important. People are important, as we say, but haven't really brought that to the fore in terms of their strategy, where they're investing in their firm or in their portfolio companies. And I think in a world where private equity is just getting more and more competitive nowadays and firms are looking for an edge, talent has started to come forth as something where firms are saying, okay, we've squeezed all the juice out of financial engineering. We squeezed all the juice out of cost cutting in these businesses. We squeezed all the juice out of, trying to find value buys in the market. Those inefficiencies have been sort of sucked out of the market. So we need a new edge, and that edge is talent. So I think I'm sort of hitting the market with this message and with a toolkit at a time when I think private equity is waking up to the idea that we need to start really proactively investing in this area. So to your actual question, what does that mean? It means a lot of different things, but I'll tell you how I approach that with clients. Not that that's the totality, but it's just, what I know best. The question of how do you put people first starts pre-closing, where one of the big things I do with private equity groups is organizational due diligence, call it, or due diligence, quality of talent, or quality of leadership, or whatever. Going in pre-closing and saying, what is the private equity firm's thesis for the deal? What needs to be true about leadership, the talent, the culture, and the capabilities in the business to make that thesis come true? Where do we sit today relative to those requirements? And what changes, investments, augmentations, hire, fire, repurpose, redeploy decisions need to get made early in the hold period in order to give that value creation plan a chance to get off the ground? So I think the whole conversation around how do you unlock the talent advantage really starts pre-closing. As you get deeper into the whole, or as you get sort of post-close, I think that the obvious thing to do is leverage those learnings that you have garnered in due diligence to make decisions. And those decisions aren't always just hire fire decisions. Those could be repurposing people in the business and applying their talents to areas of the value creation plan where they can have higher impact. It can be developing high potentials in these businesses that historically under founder ownership or in some cases oppressive leadership just haven't had the chance to flourish in their roles. But it's about making some intentional decisions about how do we unlock the talent advantage. And intangibly, the way that I do that is I help clients build a people plan. Most of these companies have value creation plans or strategic plans, or they call them different things. It's all sort of the same thing, defines how are we going to create value in these businesses. What I like to do is come in on the back end of that and say, how do you create an intentional, thoughtful people plan that will enable your value creation plan to come true? A lot we could talk about what that looks like and where some of the decisions that might end up on a people plan, but that at least gets the ball rolling in a private equity hold period around sort of capitalizing on talent.
Okay. A little bit about the plan, and not to get into all the details. In my mind, it sounds like something like this. Who do we need that does what? Who has what skills? Who needs to take on what responsibilities? What new talent do we need that we don't have today? Obviously, then there's going to be, incentivizing motivation. Like you had said, a little bit of like, okay, transitioning roles. Is it that kind of stuff? Am I being a little too generic or narrow with what I'm thinking about what it is in my head?
The way I reduce it is I'm not trying to sound cute here, but it's, how do we get the right who into the right where, focused on the right what? The right people into the right roles, focused on the right value creation objectives, initiatives, goals, whatever. And in the mental model for me really works backwards in that sequence to first start not with the who, but with the what. What are the value creation initiatives that we have aligned on? What's the focused list of initiatives we're going to pursue? Question number one. Question number two gets into the where, the roles. What roles do we need to power that value creation plan? And I've always recommended clients approach this in kind of a clean sheeted way, which, put away the org chart today. Just like scrap that for a second. That's not to say you might not land there, or you might not, that's not to say it's not going to be relevant in some way, but scrap that, rebuild it from the ground up on a clean sheet of paper. And with the guiding question in mind of, if we're trying to make this value creation agenda happen, question number one, what are the roles we need organized, configured, in what ways to support that? And then the third question becomes the who, getting the right who and the right where, focused on the right what. What are the requirements in each of those roles to give us confidence that we can make these value creation initiatives come true? What people do we have today in those roles or otherwise? And then it sort of becomes the chess game. I love this. I'm a nerd like this. I love this part of it, which is like you have this inventory, this arsenal of weapons called talented human beings. And it's about configuring, getting the right people into the right boxes on that, such that you can optimize for applying their talents at the point of highest impact. When you go through that exercise, inevitably, you'll realize there's some areas where we have some gaps. There are some people that can get sort of repurposed over here based on their skill set and the needs of the business. But that's really the exercise. How do we get the right who into the right where and focused on the right what?
Okay, no, that does make a lot of sense. It almost feels like you were a general or a chess master in a past life.
I love this stuff. I mean, this is my jam. I'll spare you my little soapbox on my just belief in the human potential that often lies latent in these businesses and what can happen if a private equity firm comes along and actually is thoughtful about how do we capitalize on and tap into this human potential. But I both have that as meaningful work to me, and I also, convinced myself over time that is the most important work a private equity buyer, SaaS or otherwise, can be doing.
That's cool. No, I do get your point, and we're on the soapbox a little bit there with you about just valuing employees. And, as lawyers, we do the whole employee transitioning and those related documents, a little bit of due diligence and stuff, usually depending on the transaction.
Yeah.
So, and, the incentivizing schemes and stuff. So we have our minds close to employees' hearts too, not in the same way, from a legal perspective. So we definitely see what you're getting.
Yeah, so I think we've built enough context at this point to really understand kind of the lay of the land of what it is that you do, Dan, and, the theory aspect of how you do it. Would love to hear, one question that comes to mind for me is, can you give us like some examples of like some case studies where the firms that you advised, we love stories here at SaaS Buyers Club. We think that the best way to exemplify, the application of anything is through a story. So do you have any case studies that you can share with us in terms of, this PE firm hired you for, this deal? Obviously, you don't have to name names or anything, but yeah, would love to hear the application in a story. Do you have anything for us?
Yeah.
In that regard?
So tons of case studies. I'll start riffing and sharing some that I think can be interesting, and you can reroute me. I think that the case study I know the best, and I think is a powerful case study in private equity, was the firm that I used to work at. This is not a sales pitch, but Alpine has built, I think it's fair to say objectively, Alpine's built a really amazing reputation in a historically homogenized private equity industry as being a real innovator on human capital. And so I'll make this more real. Let me take you back with a quick story that'll exemplify this. We, back in, I don't know, this is probably maybe 2013 or so. I remember sitting around the table, and one of the things that we had sort of embarked on a strategy where, as part of our people first strategy and ethos, one of the decisions we made was we're going to bring in new CEOs in a lot of cases in these deals, not because the founders aren't valuable or useful, just because we also often saw that what got them here isn't necessarily going to get them there. What got them to 10 million in revenue isn't the skill set that's going to get them from 10 to 100. So we would oftentimes, replace the CEO or bring in or put them in a role where they could have the biggest impact and bring in a new CEO. One of the things we realized is in doing so, we're having to go out to market and compete with every other private equity firm for top CEO talent. So the light bulb at the time was, how do we actually, instead of playing that game, which is the same game everybody else is playing, how do we create top CEO talent from within? And that was a question I think it's fair to say not a lot of private equity firms were thinking about at the time. And that ended up becoming the starting point for this CEO and training program we launched, again, probably in 2014 or so, which was aimed at creating an accelerated path for early mid-career high potentials who are high on potential, high on leadership attributes, but light on experience, creating an accelerated path for them to become mid-market CEOs. And that was good for them because up until that point, if you wanted to be a CEO, you either had to go climb the ladder in a Fortune 500 or go into a startup or go to a cert fund. But there wasn't really a model that was aimed intentionally, explicitly at creating mid-market CEOs. So we said, we think there's a market demand for that. And that solves arguably one of the most important variables in our investing equation, which is creating the sort of private equity grade CEOs that we want to be working with and backing. So we started this program. Flash forward 10 years or whatever it's been. It's just been a smashing success as measured by a bunch of things. It's one of the most sought after, I think to this day, I'm a little removed from the action now, but I think to this day is still one of the most applied for roles out of Stanford, Harvard, maybe Kellogg, MBA programs. Don't quote me on that, but at one point in time, this was the most applied to role in top MBA programs. But furthermore, the validation of that being a winning strategy has come in the form of returns. Like seeing early career, first-time CEOs crush it in the way that some of these have validates the hypothesis we had at the time that high potential early career executives that have high attributes like emotional quotient, adversity quotient, growth mindset are ready to be, provided the right exposure, right experience, right mentorship and guidance, are ready to be CEOs and can be successful CEOs a lot earlier than the rest of the world thinks they can. So, that's one example of a strategy for unlocking the talent advantage. It's just been smashingly successful.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And the same lesson, I guess, goes in sorry, my headphones, though they were in the charging case, are not charged.
Right Apple letter.
Yeah, it's Bose.
Oh.
So you'd expect more. But anyway, so if my volume if I need to speak louder, just tell me.
You're good.
So the lesson there I see can apply to also generally just how would people buy a business. They can choose to grow from the existing management team's talent. And there might be even some specific lessons learned that you have. Like what are go ahead and tell us, what's one or two good things that you guys use as part of that program to grow those people? And it might have been motivation. It might have been like subject matter training, might have just been throwing them in the wind and seeing how they sail.
One learning that I think is relevant to your audience of leaders is to go back to something I touched on a moment ago, which is what this firm, what our firm found is a lot of success in putting people in roles where like the shoes were a little too big for them. And people needed to have a few fundamental attributes to succeed in that sort of environment. But if you had, baseline sort of minimum acceptable level of IQ, but more importantly, what we called adversity quotient. This is the grit factor, the bust through walls factor, the I'm going to get kicked down and get right back up factor. You had adversity quotient, you had growth mindset, learning aptitude, an ability to learn at an accelerated pace, a real sponge-like quality and just wanting to learn and get better continuously and faster. If you had some of those underlying qualities, then our modus operandi became just give people more than you think you're comfortable giving them. Not a ton more, but give them a little more than is comfortable for you and is probably going to be comfortable for them. And more often than not, people tended to rise to the occasion. And that's a formula right there there's a great book, Multipliers, that is like I'm not in the business of hawking leadership books to people, but is one of my favorite leadership books of all time. And it sort of speaks to this idea of like a great way to grow people at an accelerated rate is to sort of put them out over their skis a little bit, induce some challenge stress. I don't remember if that phrase is used in the book or not, but induce some challenge stress and know that if you have that combination of attributes, people tend to not only rise to the occasion, but they just get better a lot faster than they otherwise would. And in doing so can create a lot more value for your company long term.
Okay. No, I like that a lot. Put highly competent people into adverse scenarios and, it enables them to grow. It gives them the ability to grow and adapt and prove themselves. And that makes a lot of sense. I like that a lot. You definitely see, with PE being such a traditional conservative industry, you're managing people a lot of money, right? It's definitely in that, what am I trying to say, like high air of finance. And so it's kind of hard to see, and sorry, I'm robbing you of the conversation.
All good, man.
It's kind of hard to see that style matched together with the general approach to PE. So was there a lot of, when you guys first started doing it, was there a lot of tension in doing it and giving people the little rope? Was it something that you guys just had confidence in?
These things start at the top. And so if the founder or the CEO of a business or a firm or whatever the organization isn't of that mindset, that people have a lot of latent potential that oftentimes isn't being unlocked. And by following this sort of playbook I'm describing, you can unlock more of it. If you're not of that mindset, then it's just not going to go anywhere. But our founder, to his great credit, the founder of this firm, for as long as I had been around there, that was just sort of how he operated, just giving young people, inexperienced people a lot of rope and giving them the needed level of support. But I'm thinking back to my early time in private equity. I was tasked with doing things at the time that were arguably way above my pay grade. And I had and on half of them, I had no idea what I was doing. But because I like to think I have some amount of those attributes, I'll figure shit out. I'll figure things out. It's not going to be pretty every time, but I'll kind of grit my way towards and iterate my way towards figuring out some sort of solution. I just got smarter faster than I otherwise would if I was relegated to being the model guy that sat in the corner just building the financial model. And so I really appreciate that as a strategy, as a leadership mindset, and I appreciate that personally because it just allowed me to go farther faster early on in my career.
I hear you loud and clear. That makes a lot of sense. Omeed, I'll let you have a say.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so what I heard you say is people in positions that stretch them. And one of the kind of methodologies, and correct me if I am misstating anything here at any point, one of the methodologies that you guys implemented was kind of the CEO in training. So you look from within the organization to kind of appoint people where the founder needs to be replaced, because so often, founders get to a certain milestone in the business. They're not able to grow it beyond that milestone. And that's often why they end up selling the business to begin with, because they know they've kind of, hit the ceiling of their capability. They want to take chips off the table. And, that's when PE comes in and, buys these businesses and so on and so forth. And then once the PE firm acquires the business, when you work with these PE firms, it sounds like how you often work with these PE firms is you might look for the next leader of the business from within the business. That's this CEO in training kind of approach that you've taken in the past. Specifically, what you look for with respect to these potential CEOs are these different quotients, the emotional quotient, the adversity quotient, so on and so forth. How is it that you evaluate the people in the business for those quotients? Is it that you work with the founder to say, hey, these are kind of the things that we look for? Do you sit down and you interview each of the people? Like, do you give them a personality test? Like, how do you actually evaluate, the people for these different attributes?
The short answer is using a combination of structured interviews and assessments. Mm-hmm. Assessments being sort of assessment tools. Depending on what the use case is, where you are in the deal cycle, you might apply those in different ways. For example, pre-closing, if I'm going and doing organizational due diligence on the part of a private equity sponsor, I'll go in, I'll hold structured interviews with the management team. In that, I'm aimed at not only understanding them, their skill set, their style, their attributes, the degree to which those map to some of the things we've talked about. I'm also understanding how they work together as a leadership unit, how they lead the business, the culture they've created there. And that sort of paints a rounded, holistic picture of, well, how, in light of that, and comparing that to some of the things that I know to be important to building a high-performance team and culture, how well-positioned is this business to be successful post-closing? When you're doing that, in the case of post-closing, in the case of an executive hire, hey, we're going to bring in a new CRO, or the business has never had a CFO, we're going to bring in a CFO, use the same tools. Structured interview, I call it the deep dive interview, which is, it's oftentimes, 3 to 5 hours long.
Wow.
And it's amazing. It's amazing. And that may feel like a sort of, I don't know, when you hear it for the first time, you get that reaction for 3 to 5 hours. Oh my gosh, feels like a proctology exam. But the reality is, it is such an amazing way to paint a high fidelity picture of who is this human being sitting before me? Do they have the things we need in this role? And if they do, how do I leverage this understanding of their strengths, their weaknesses, their attributes, their style, their mindset, their motivations, all the things that you can get out of this interview? How do I leverage all of that to put them in the best position to succeed? And so it's a good thing for you as a hiring manager or a private equity firm to, in the interest of making a high quality hiring decision. It's also a good thing for them, because if I'm an executive going into a new role, I want to know that the people hiring me understand what they're getting with me and have the raw material and sort of the synthesized view of how to best support me, because that's in their interest. It's in my interest too.
I love that. No, it makes a lot of sense. It does. I could just definitely see it being, here's my whole work day, interviewing 1 or 2 people. That's interesting.
I was doing one of these, this is part of the work I do nowadays, is private equity firms will bring me in, or their portfolio companies will bring me in to, hey, we've got a finalist candidate or 2 finalist candidates for this CEO role or CRO role. Run this process and give us your recommendation on which these is the best fit. So I was doing one of these on a couple of days ago on Friday, and I heard from the guy walking out of there. I was in there for probably 5.5 hours with this candidate. I heard from him the same thing I hear from a lot of people on that side of the table, which is, number one, man, it's not every day that I'm replaying the entire story of my life and career in this forum. Number two, man, that helped me to connect some dots that I hadn't really connected until now, in terms of why I am the way I am today, in terms of some of the things that have propelled and fueled my success. And there's a lot of usefulness in that awareness as an executive, because it's, having that awareness is going to help you to, be successful going forward. So all that said, it's sort of I hear that same reaction. They go into it thinking, this is weird. This is going to feel like an interrogation. They walk out saying, that was really interesting and useful to me, not only to the client, but to me.
Give us some insight into what that interview sounds like that makes it useful for them in that way. I'm so curious, because I think people is the coolest part of business, to be honest. It's my favorite part. So I'm all about this conversation. I don't know if you ever read the book, Who Not How. I think it's by Dan Sullivan, kind of like the go-to book with regard to people capital. And I don't know how you feel about that book. I'd also be curious. But first question is, what does that interview really sound like that, is enlightening for people in that way?
What it is really, and I didn't invent this. I've sort of developed my own spin and my own version of this going forward, but there's a great book called Top Grading. It was written back in the late 80s or early 90s. It's about this thick, kind of a tough read, but pretty interesting. It's about a process that hiring managers, and I'll use that term liberally to include private equity people that are hiring people, executives that are hiring people, whatever. Hiring managers can use to develop a base of objective data on which to make a hiring decision. And so the way you get that, to your question, per the top rating methodology, is a chronological structured interview that goes back to early in the person's career, in some cases before their professional career, getting into their childhood and their education, and systematically marching your way towards present, stopping at each job along the way and asking a handful of questions. What were you hired to do, i.e., what's the scorecard for the role in, role X? What were the high points? What were the low points? Who did you report to? What is that person going to say about you when we talk to them as a reference? And what prompted your transition between role X and role Y? And of course, you're digging in, you're double clicking on some areas as you go, depending on what's most relevant to the role you're hiring for. But if you ask those same 5 questions over an entire career's worth of roles, you start to just see themes. You start to see themes in terms of what has made this person successful, where have they been most successful, what have been the most common challenges they've run into, or what have been the root issues behind their failures. And those themes then give you a body of data to then go plot against the requirements for the role you're hiring for and saying, hey, based on what I'm learning about, again, their skills, their abilities, their competencies, their motivations, their tendencies, their habits, based on what I'm seeing about all of that in this data, how does that then help me come to a conclusion as to how well positioned they are to do this particular job? And so it's like, think of it, that's the long answer. The short answer is it's like almost like having a candidate replay the movie or the story of their life and career.
Now it makes sense why it's like 5 hours long.
So what's so cool though, guys, this is I hope I have fortunately, I've had the chance to sit on the interviewee side of this. I've done this interview at, hundreds of times with people, but I've sat on the other side of the table being interviewed in this style before. And it's all the things I said earlier. It's, it's sort of maybe a little arduous in the moment, but when I was driving home after this interview, I was like, man, there's just so much benefit, personal benefit to just like jogging your memory through your life's journey. I mean, maybe it made me understand myself better than I did walking in. It made me proud of some moments that I had long forgotten about, but were powerful moments of my own journey. So I say all that because I hope, you probably don't hope this, but I hope at some point in time, you guys have the ability to go through.
I was going to say, do you have 5 hours right now so that we could do this on air?
I'll catch you guys
on air.
I'm busy. No, I hear you. I mean, I wouldn't mind it, but
I pretty much do that to Joe every time we talk anyway. So
hey, that's cool though. I mean, we're both ways on that. I mean,
I'll maybe leave this topic on this point. There was a study that was done. I'm going to wing a study at you, but there was a research piece I remember from, I came across it years ago from Green Peak Partners, who used to be doing this type of work, and Cornell University. And they concluded, they surveyed a bunch of executives, and they were trying to figure out what factors tend to lead to executive success. It was a big question, but they were trying to develop, a point of view on that. One of the things I remember coming out of that, which has stuck with me ever since, is self-awareness is one of the most highly correlated factors with executive success in private equity-backed businesses, and probably businesses of any sort. And it makes sense if you think about it. Like, it's difficult to lead others until you know and therefore can lead yourself. If you're not self-aware, it's going to make it more difficult to know where you're likely to stumble. It's going to make it more difficult to know who you need to surround yourself with. It's going to compromise your ability to know how you relate to people in the moment in a business setting if you don't have sort of momentary self-awareness. So like self-awareness, which this sort of process can help foster, is the meta skill, I'm convinced, that is universally applicable no matter if you're in SaaS, you're not SaaS, you're a big company, small company, whatever. That's the universal meta skill that executives need to have. And you don't just wake up with it one morning. It's something you have to foster by having experiences like this.
You're singing our bird song, Dan. You really are, man.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm winging my perspectives at you on this, but tell me, how do you guys think about that? I see you nodding, but
Omeed, I'll let you go first, but I was just agreeing with Omeed there. I was saying, I was restraining my excitement there and being like,
I think both Joe and I, we're ardent proponents of meditation. So meditation, I don't know if you meditate or not, Dan, but, meditation is one of the kind of key techniques and tools for self-knowledge, one of the ancient techniques and tools for self-knowledge. So when I said you were singing our bird song, it's like, you're like literally speaking exactly what it is that Joe and I are very much about. So yeah, Joe.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah, totally.
I'm a meditator. I've been in and out over time, but I can look at my, I'm proud to admit, I've got a 29-day hot streak going right now on Insight Timer.
Insight Timer.
I'm back in
all right. How long a day?
11 and a half minutes.
Nice.
I used to do 102. I did TM back in earlier.
Okay.
I was doing 22 minutes a day then, but I do 11. I have 2 young children now, so I cut that in half. But what I was going to ask is I have my own take on this question from my lived experience, but what has that given you and how has that been useful to you in a professional context?
Wow.
This is a really fun subject, and let's definitely tie it into the subject matter of the podcast, because we do talk about this stuff for hours. And so, I always consider myself so I have kind of an interesting background there. I lived in Asia, Japan for 7.5 years. I've been to a lot of different Buddhist temples, and Omeed's been around the block too. And I did martial arts since I was 18. And so I had a lot of this background in meditation related stuff, but I only started meditating like 4 years ago. And so before 4 years ago, I was already pretty self-aware, was already pretty, it would help with self-learning. It would help with understanding other people and my reactions to them better. But after doing meditation, I feel like I was able to parse things separately. Like, as a stupid example, I have bad neck pain. And I started realizing during meditation that I was over-associating my neck pain with a lot of my personal experiences. So I might have a call with somebody, be like, my judgment on the call wouldn't have been so well, because part of it was this background pain. So in meditation, as you learn that the awareness is, you can't even say the fundamental matter, but is a fundamental thing, you start to be able to take your awareness off of things that it's stuck on. And so you might, for example, and I'll give one more example, I'll throw back to Omeed, is, you learn that, and I have learned that, I had my awareness stuck on certain things. Like, I had one bad deal done with some people I trusted, some business partners. We sold a business. They cut me out of the deal in the last second. It was crazy stuff that you would never imagine would happen between friends. I had to sue them for it. And that was sitting in my awareness for like years. It was just simmering. And I was able to parse that away. And it affects your judgment on stuff. That's Alex.
Oh man, here.
Yeah, from my side, it's developing the moment to moment awareness that I think is it's the act of mindfulness. In developing the act of mindfulness, I think one of the biggest benefits of meditation is learning how to take meditation outside of the cushion, or learning to take meditation outside of just the times where one is meditating. And it's through the development of that awareness that I can understand how it is that I react to situations. And through the strengthening of the mindfulness muscle, in noticing those reactions, I can circumvent those reactions so that instead of reacting, I can respond. And it's through that self-knowledge that I actually become the driver of the car. And that's actually...
Love that metaphor.
Thank you. And I think that's really what makes a really great leader, is being able to respond to situations where maybe, the purpose of a leader is to direct and guide and so on and so forth. And in the challenging moments when shit is hitting the fan, instead of reacting, taking the reins and responding in a way that the moment calls for, which is another thing that I think that meditation is really good for. Attunement, which is super important.
Love that word.
Super important. Emotional intelligence, I think, comes from attunement. which comes from mindfulness, which comes from awareness. So many things.
I love that. That.
Thank you.
You're sort of making with your own lived experience the same point I was making with some, study earlier, which is like self-awareness is important to everything that follows, and I'm picking up what you're laying down. I think back to, I've stopped short of trying to preach at executives or friends for that matter about getting into meditation. I can easily get a little, because I've seen the benefit, I've seen the light, it's easy to get a little preachy on it or platitudinal or soapboxy. What I have learned to do is just say, well, let me just tell you, if I see somebody that appears to be stressed or not have control over their emotions or be struggling with momentary self-awareness or knowing how they're showing up or impacting others or whatever, instead of trying to just recommend meditation, I'll just share my experience with them, which is I started meditating in maybe 2016 or 17. And I honestly don't remember what caused me to get into it. I've always been like a self-improver sort of personality. I'm always trying to find ways to just get better and grow. But I was at this particular moment in time, I was in an especially stressful operating role. We had regulatory issues. I had regulators breathing down my neck. I'm sitting in, meetings with regulators and lenders when we were nearing covenant. I mean, it was just sort of like a very challenging period of time. And I think back to that period, and I think back to it with a level, there's just like I just felt like sort of grounded in it. I remember vividly being in like a high stress, intense meeting with regulators, where I was like, I had the conscious thought of, I'm really glad I have built a meditation practice, because what I'm wanting to do, what my instinct is wanting to do right now is defend, is object, is all the things that would ultimately be highly counterproductive. But having that, I think it's Dan Harris that says what meditation gives you is an extra second, which has always stuck with me. Like in those moments, in the heat of battle, that extra second of just awareness of what's happening, where am I right now, and how do I need to show up to best serve the objective is so important. So I'm not trying to be dramatic or grand, but I think like that, having meditation at that point in my life saved me from probably making some bad decisions and, succumbing to my stress response and things like that. It was big.
No, I love that story there. It's so true that I didn't have that wasn't my introduction to meditation. I was actually chilling at the time, and so I had free time to dedicate. A little bit different story, but I do hear you there. We've definitely seen CEOs or non-lawyers, because lawyers dealing with regulators, I guess not all lawyers, but for us, that's kind of like a bread and butter. We know the rigmarole, but it's funny to see operators go in there and just because maybe it's their first time experience. And so that's cool that was able to assist you there. I feel like,
I don't know. I did not expect the conversation to go in this direction.
I know, right? We usually don't sometimes it'll come up, but now this time it's come up, and I'm like, man, it would be fun if we also did. It would be like professionals.
I was thinking that I'd be like, wow, it'd be really cool, actually. Dan, I don't really see you talking about, this as a thing. I mean, I hear, self-awareness is kind of like a top level concept. I don't really think what other ways I think actually, I'm going to answer my own question, and I'm curious what you think about this. I think the two primary ways to develop self-awareness, one is for sure meditation. I think journaling is another really great practice as well for self-awareness. What are your thoughts on, I hear you kind of raising the flag of self-awareness as one of the most important values for a leader, but what would you say, what advice would you give to people to develop more self-awareness?
I mean, I think you hit on two big ones that immediately come to mind. So I would add to that, understanding the impact that you're having on others can help further your self-awareness. Self-awareness, not strictly internally in your internal state, but how you show up and relate to the world. And so that can come in simple, everyday, tactical ways of you're in a meeting and you're giving a presentation or you're, whatever. You say something and you sort of you read the room gives you, you sort of get a feeling that something didn't land. And you have a choice in that moment. You can pretend like it didn't happen or just plow right through, or you can stop in the moment and say, hold on a second. I sensed that didn't land with you. How did you receive that? Or like, what were you thinking when I said that thing? You can do that in the moment. You can pull the person aside later. But what that does is not only does that build goodwill with your team, the fact that you're actually mindful of wanting to create an experience for them that's positive and what have you, but it also can help you to just better understand how do other people experience and perceive you, which deepens your sense of self-awareness. So that's another thing. Admittedly, there's been periods of time where I've been very intentional about that. There's been periods of time where I've just been, not very good at that. Mm-hmm. But I think that can be a useful tool too. You asked me the question of like, Dan, why aren't you clearly have a lot of energy for this topic. Why aren't you sort of preaching from the mountaintop on this? And truth be told, it's because up until 29 days ago, I felt like a total phony where like I knew 2017 to 2019 or pre-COVID, I was in a great mindfulness practice, had all the sort of positive impact on my life I shared. And you can imagine COVID through recently, my relationship with mindfulness and meditation has been, on and off. And I felt that. I have felt that viscerally. Higher stress, more reactive. I'm a father of 2 now, and I sort of had a moment, 30 days ago where I was like, nothing dramatic, but like, I don't want to, I know the benefit of meditation, and I'm actively choosing right now to forego that benefit because I can't find my rhythm again. So in part, like all of us, I'm sort of finding my own way with this. And so I don't know.
Thanks for sharing, man. Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
That makes sense. It makes sense. And I'm happy to hear that you found that rhythm again. Keep it up. You have our support, give you a little emotional support there and keeping that up. It is hard, like if you get out of your, like I do regular jogs 3 times a week and then do a little of this, do a little of that. I have my own routines. And whenever I get bumped out of them, it's just like you said, it's annoying to me. That I'm out of the rhythm, and then you kind of have to get yourself back into it and not get in your own way. And there's a whole dance there that everybody needs to.
Well, there's a tension too between like knowing what's possible if you lean into practices like that, be it jogging, be it whatever, knowing what's possible and giving yourself some grace when you aren't in that rhythm. There's some tension there, but I think the duality of that's very important. And I think about that in a leadership context too, of like, if my leader or somebody I'm working with does something that is self-unaware or has a negative impact on the team, it's like, how do I help them become aware of that? And how do I give them some grace knowing that like they're human like the rest of us? But I think the key in all of this is how do you recover in those moments? It's okay to get off. I've convinced myself it's okay to get off track. I have 2 young kids. Life's been crazy. We moved across states. We have 2 young kids. My wife changed jobs. I started my own thing. I wrote, it's okay that you get off track, but how do you recover?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard you said. Oh, go ahead. What were you going to say then?
You go.
Yeah, I've heard it be said that it's not about the breaking that a conflict causes. It's actually about the repair. And so conflict is natural. It happened, but it's through the repair that the bond can be re-strengthened in a way that maybe even previously it hadn't before, because when the breaking happens, the truth comes out, so on and so forth. Emotions are shared. There's actually an opportunity for 2 people to come to deeper understanding than previously before. Yes. And so we don't need to be better at avoiding conflict as a leader. We need to be better at repair, which is what happens after.
Love that. May I tie this back to SaaS?
Please.
I mean, yeah, I think the same idea applies in a customer setting too, where I've seen this before, but look, you're going to get off track with some customers. And just like how you respond to that in the meeting example from earlier can either strengthen or degrade your team's experience in that case. How you respond in the case of a customer issue can strengthen or further degrade your standing with that customer. I've seen secondhand and experienced firsthand the fact that I've made lots of mistakes at not responding to customer issues well, but I've seen some examples of by repairing customer fractures in a way that is human, in a way that is authentic, in a way that is committed to their success and committed to making it right. To your point, it can build a stronger bond, not a weaker bond, not a neutral bond, but a stronger bond when all is said and done. So I think there's very real practical business application to this idea in that way and probably others.
Dan, oh, go ahead, Joe.
I hadn't thought, maybe this is, no, I was saying, maybe there's something that's just kind of like passively in my brain, but I definitely hadn't thought of it that way before. Or maybe it's kind of like, thrown into a junk pile of my relationship. But yeah, that is very insightful. Go on.
To kind of, to swing the conversation, I love this, by the way. I mean, we could do a whole podcast series on just these types of conversations, honestly. And I know. Maybe I would love that. I love that. And actually, now that I know this, Dan, in general, I'll get with you offline. But we host events all the time here in Cincinnati, around mindfulness and awareness and self-knowledge and so on and so forth. So we'd love to have you join us. What are your thoughts on these tech layoffs?
Thoughts on the tech layoffs? Oh man, tell me your thoughts. What I'm doing right now, self-awareness, momentary self-awareness. I'm pivoting out of that conversation, taking a hard left into the meta.
It was like a 35-mile.
Wind it up for me. Get me in gear on this. Tell me what you're seeing and thinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's addressing bloat. I think, a lot of people are pointing to it as sign of impending recession, and I think there's a tie-in for me, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. You're in the business of working with PE firms on the people side, and I'm gonna throw a little bit of a curveball at you here a little bit, but typically, the negative connotation that comes with being acquired by a PE firm is PE comes in and they slash and burn, right? So they come in,
they don't have a personal feeling,
right?
The people side of things. And this is
totally
generalization, of course.
Totally, but. Yeah. I think it's some people think it's a sign of a shrinking market. It's mismanagement by the tech companies. But I'm curious from your perspective as someone who's so focused on talent and people, and even, the kind of conversation that we had where, it's not about the conflict. It's often about the repair. We saw with some of the tech companies like massive layoffs where, they sent people home, they fired them, and then they asked them to come back, for example. So just curious, stream of consciousness, what comes through for you?
I don't know that I have anything especially insightful to say about the why or the reasoning, the sort of logical reasoning behind these layoffs and what that could indicate, macro-wise or whatever. What comes to mind as I'm listening to you is sort of the same thing you were describing, which is making the business decision. How you got there and then making the needed business decision is sort of one thing. How you execute that business decision, in this case, one that can have big impact on livelihoods, is an entirely different thing. But I think people remember you more so for the latter than the former. I mean, we could probably jog our memories back through the last years of case studies on this, but there are examples where layoffs have been done with grace, with humility, with care. There have been examples of the counter opposite. And, my hope is that leaders of all different types of companies and sectors are sort of filing those case studies away and saying, to the extent that I have to do a layoff, God forbid, or I have to fire one person, how do I borrow from some of this to just do so in a way that honors the business decision that we need to make, but does so with the needed level of grace and humility? And I don't know. I've had to do layoffs before. It always sucks. It's never fun. And sometimes it's necessary. We could talk about the whole private equity angle of this and the idea that private equity, for right or wrong, has developed a reputation for, kind of squeezing these businesses dry. But I don't know. So I don't know if that's remotely useful.
That's fine. I know it's also kind of a more complex subject. Like, you would have look into it and kind of see what costs were cut where, why, what advantages wanted to be done. I mean, and kind of throwing it at you doesn't allow you to avail yourself of that research. But no, that's the Fiverr response. I have some thoughts there too, Omeed, which because when I saw the next recent round of layoffs, I just started laughing because all these and this is again a generalization. Obviously, some company, everybody's doing it differently and has different reasons. Some companies just aren't doing healthy. That's not, or some departments just aren't doing well. They need to transition people out or terminate them. And so, however, the big problem for me is that these large cap tech companies, Silicon Valley based, San Francisco Bay Area, people are already looking at them now so distrustfully from a career perspective. So in Italy, here's kind of the opposite. When I was young, my dad would tell me, my dad's from Italy, he would say, in Italy, you would be the hotel bellman your whole life. That's what you would do. And actually living in Japan has a lifelong career culture also. In more recent last 20 years, it's changed up because of the Western influence, but they have that. Whereas in Silicon Valley, it's like how many, like a couple years, 3 to 5 years, or, everybody's different. Somebody might be really good in his area, might be there 10 and 50 years, but the expectation is that you're not going to be delivering long-term value to the business. And if that's the community's trust towards the business, just imagine how little effort those employees would be putting in for the role. So if you see yourself at a business, as sometimes lawyers do at big firms for 20 years, 30 years, you're going to really be part of the business culturally, mentally. You're going to be giving all those great positives to the business. But if you're thinking, okay, people get laid off so frequently, I'm only going to be here 5 years before I go do my own startup. You might just be winging it the whole time. Or if you're really good at your job, I know it's hard to wing some highly technical roles, but I know people who have multiple jobs that are technical people, and they're just winging all of them, and they don't care. It's kind of that remote work economy. And so I think it's just net bad. There's a lot of mistrust being built around a lot of these brands, and that's very hard to recover from. In fact, it's highly unlikely these brands will have the awareness to do so, or be willing to invest in that. That's a very mistrust is hard to recover. Yep.
Well, I think hindsight bias would say we also have to remember that these things are a lot clearer in hindsight too. Like some of the, if I can speculate for a second without having dug fully into this, I think it's fair to say some amount of the layoffs that we've seen recently were just a result of overextending, overhiring. When times were good and we're sort of, paring back and trying to find a new normal. And hindsight's 20/20 on these things. It's easy to look in the rearview mirror and say, oh, we shouldn't have overhired. But at the time, you have to give some benefit of the doubt to say these business leaders were making the decision that they thought was in the best interest of the business. And so that's not to say that's a right perspective or wrong perspective or whatever. It's just another lens through which to look at this, state of play to say, easy to criticize now, but hindsight's 20/20. We can take learning from it, but hindsight's 20/20.
I hear you. So Sundar Pichai, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. He was in the news as part of this. In his employees, some may have been one. Some employees commented that he handled it very inartfully, like a robot, kind of just doling out punishments. In my head, there's the Tesla robot. If you saw it in the news recently, just you're terminated. But, that could very much so stem just from the fact that a lot of these leaders are promoted engineers or technical people that may not have, and me commenting on Sundar's relational skills is not necessarily an apt thing to do because I don't know anything about it. But, there is that leap that can be made from that comment or those comments made by employees that maybe there's just a lacking of maybe a salesperson would have had a different approach from understanding that human element as far as
Sure. Yeah. It's like separate the business decision from the delivery of that business decision. I think those are two sort of interrelated but distinct things that end up coming into play here.
I agree. And I would want no comment on my reflections either, given that they're just off the top of my head. What do I know about the subject, really? I didn't do research on that.
To kind of reel the conversation further back into the sphere, that you work in, Dan. So you work with PE firms, on the talent side. It sounds like the kind of access point, the entry point is the due diligence stage, is what I heard. Is you come in kind of pre-closing, you can provide organizational due diligence, advisory. How does a PE firm, how do they realize that they need your services?
The greatest purchase catalyst or adoption catalyst for firms that haven't done this historically, going to actually wanting to make this a part of their playbook, are mistakes.
Okay. We love mistakes. So those are other...
I mean, it's like all it takes... And by the way, I've slipped into many of these traps myself, which is why I sort of stood up some product offerings aimed at helping others to address these gaps. All it takes is one failed CEO hire, or, being a year into a hold period and realizing, hey, the culture is a mess and it's actually really compromising our ability to move some of these value creation balls forward. We didn't know that pre-closing because we just sort of did a cursory due diligence. All it takes is one of these mistakes to realize, if we're able to get ahead of this and go into close, having a clear, not crystal clear, but a clearer, higher fidelity view of the leadership, the talent, the culture, the capabilities, it allows us to do two things. Number one, make a better underwriting decision. There are deals I actually wouldn't have, if I had been better at this early in my career, there are deals I probably wouldn't have done. They're going to help you make a better underwriting decision. At a minimum, it can help you, even if you proceed with the deal, make a more thoughtful valuation decision. Some of these gap areas or risk areas end up meaning it's going to be more difficult to achieve our deal case, our sort of upside case or base case. And so the value I'm willing to pay for the business ought to naturally be lower. So it'll help you make a better underwriting decision, and then it can help you just make smarter, faster decisions post-closing when you own it. So that tends to be the biggest purchase catalyst. Is you get whacked by one of these decisions, you pay the price, and then you say, okay, we need to, this whole like cursory take management out to dinner, stick a finger in the wind. Yeah, I think they're pretty strategic, and the guy seems or gal seems smart. Like, those are, hearing things like that tend to be tip-offs to me that you're just doing the sort of like 80,000 foot view of or diligence. And that can work sometimes. You can get lucky sometimes, but it'll come back to bite you at some point.
Talk to us about what I heard you say is, had you known this, had you applied these principles, there would have been some deals that you wouldn't have done. What do those dynamics, what do those scenarios typically look like? What should PE firms be looking out for in terms of deals that they shouldn't be doing from this vantage point or perspective?
First thing that comes to mind, it always, to my mind, starts with the CEO. That's the easy button, and that's not the end all be all, but the tone at the top is a real thing. And I think the first question you need to be asking yourself is, does this CEO have the stuff we need to make the next chapter of growth and success happen? There's a whole conversation around how do you decode that? How do you go about developing a view on that? We talked about some of that earlier, but I think that's a big thing. Another thing, speaking of mistakes made, that is easy to overlook but can have big bearing on the likelihood of success is culture. And culture, I almost sort of like cringe a little bit when I use that word, because it's become so buzzwordy out there. But it's one of those things, like, it's both buzzwordy and often used very generically, and it's so damn important. And I think about, as a left brain former finance guy, it took me a long time to wrap my brain around like what is culture? It's like kind of fluffy and squishy. Like, what is? I think it's important, but I can't really put my finger on it. And I've learned to view culture merely as the collection of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are most prevalent in an organization. So if you want to know what the culture is, go be a fly on the wall, hang out in the office, sit in the corner in team meetings or management meetings, and ask yourself, what are the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors I see most often in this business? Step one is defining, understanding the culture. Step two is figuring out which elements of that can support our value creation agenda and which could really get in the way of our value creation agenda. So there's some obvious answers. If you go into a team meeting and the CEO is a tyrant, or he or she is, highly oppressive, or is reaming people in a team setting, those are obvious indicators. Some of those you may be able to easily suss out without, a big due diligence thing pre-closing. Some you might not. But then there's more subtle things. This just gets into real subtleties, but, there's organizations I've worked with that have that tend to approach things from a fear-based place. So when there's a new opportunity that presents itself, the team's immediate reaction is to tap the brakes on it and convince themselves, why shouldn't we do this, as opposed to what are the arguments to do this and how can we maybe de-risk some of the downsides. So these are like subtle cultural elements that may be difficult to suss out if you're not a trained eye. But if you think about the fear-based example, can actually really impact your ability to drive value creation. Because if there's a new initiative you need to do and the team is going to approach it from a place of hesitance as opposed to a place of figure it outness, that could really impact the likelihood of success on that initiative. So I'm riffing here. I don't even know if I'm going to track to your question. But.
No, I actually took notes on a lot of what you said there.
No, it's very much so on point. And Omeed was really asking, hey, what are some exact things that people, PE firms should be on the lookout for from a people's perspective and due diligence? And could you give us one story? And I know you've given us so many examples which were derived from your experiences, but why don't you give us one story of a really bad circumstance or something you uncovered that was a big problem in due diligence that you either avoided at the time or you maybe even solved it, or you wish you had avoided at the time. That's not in line with something we've already discussed. If there are.
One, I mean, just as recency bias, one that's jumping to mind was, this may not be an interesting story, but I'll lay it out, and if you want to double click on it, you can. The private equity firm was headed towards close, sort of full steam ahead, thinking they were going to close this deal. It was a SaaS business, a smaller, sort of niche-focused SaaS business. Founder was still running it, but he was sort of phasing out. His heir apparent was in the business and starting to take on more responsibility. The private equity firm, I think, was of the mind, hey, we just want to close this and then figure out under the assumption that this heir apparent is our successor CEO. This would have been a first-time CEO. And so they tapped me to help them understand, is this guy backable, among other things. They wanted to understand some, kind of the full totality of some of the things we talked about, the culture, the talent beyond just the CEO. That was one of the big questions they had, was just affirm for us, validate, this is the language they use, validate for us that this CEO is backable. And my conclusion was, I think you have enough risk. I understand your thesis. I know what is needed in a CEO to make that thesis come true. Now that I'm layering this CEO and their DNA on top of that requirement, I think you got enough risk here to this person not succeeding that I either wouldn't do the deal, or you got to figure out a plan and mobilize on a plan quickly. And it wasn't because the CEO didn't have some of the skills that they would need, but it was more so some of the underlying attributes of didn't really demonstrate the growth mindset to be able to rise into or grow into some of the new requirements of this elevated role. Didn't see a ton of adversity quotient in their background. And this was a business where it's a small scale stage, growth stage SaaS business. You're going to get kicked on your backside every now and again. So didn't have some of those fundamental attributes. And so that the punchline of the story is, to my client's credit, they ended up, not doing the deal because they said, and there were a few other factors that played into this, but understanding that they would need to bring in a new CEO, that could create, change management issues in the business, and there was some loyalty to this person and all sorts of things. It sort of added another layer of risk that when layered on top of a few other things, had them saying, we either need to pay a much lower price for this business to offset some of this risk, or we just can't do the deal. And so I guess the learning from that, I don't know, that's an interesting story, but I think the learning from that is like,
I think it's great. It does. The stories don't need to be exciting as long as they're.
When the big takeaway, the thing that I really appreciated about my client is, it's one thing to do this sort of work and pay lip service to, hey, talent's important and we really want to understand the talent before we do the deal and all that sort of stuff. And it's another thing to take in learnings about those things and use those to make a well-informed red light, green light decision on the deal. And the fact that they had the courage of their conviction to say, yeah, I think this is in combination with these other things, sort of a deal breaker, I think was just a difficult, you guys have been there too. You're on the 10-yard line of closing the deal. It's not always easy to stick to your guns and pull the plug on a deal at the last minute. But I really appreciated the sort of courage and conviction they had.
No, I do love that story.
I liked it too. I thought it really exemplified, the value prop in terms of how important it is to evaluate people in the business, and to the point where sometimes the deal doesn't get done. Because my question was going to be, I'm curious, how, the question comes up, okay, this private equity firm is going to acquire this business. we talked about this kind of CEO in training, or, replacing the leader at the helm. Couldn't it be that, the previous leader of the business was identified as a potential liability for the continuation of the business? Just replace him. How does that kind of factor in, or how does that play in? And what does that process of coming to that determination look like?
Yeah, I mean, your choices are, if you come to that conclusion that I know what is needed in this role, I now know what I'm getting with the CEO I'm backing, and I see sort of a mismatch there, your choices are proceed with backing them and accept the risk. There's a chance you're wrong. There's a chance they prove you wrong. I've been proven wrong before. Take that risk, or make a decision to get somebody else in there knowing that you're accepting another set of risks, which include transition risk, cultural risk, if that person has a following. This ultimately just comes down to, I don't know of a better, more algorithmic way of approaching it than just saying you have to apply some business judgment and know which one of those scenarios, and not know, but develop a view on which one of those scenarios is going to serve us better. And it's not always cut and dry. I mean, it's easy to sit here and say, especially with hindsight bias, easy to sit here and say that, in that scenario, just replace the CEO, next question. But it's not always that easy. To your point, there are some of these other factors that play into it, not the least of which is, sort of alliances and allegiances in the business and the cultural implications. And look, when you make a CEO change, there can be 6 to 12 months of stagnance, sometimes backsliding as you're making that change. Sometimes you get better immediately if you have a tyrant CEO in place. Sometimes you get better immediately, addition by subtraction. But oftentimes, there's going to be a period where it's going to be clunky as you're making that transition. You have to have the courage to know that long-term, the best decisions are made with the long-term in mind. Long-term, this is the right call, even if it requires us to take some short-term hits.
Omeed, so I was, go ahead, but I was noting the time now. We are at our time, and not to rush this lovely conversation, but I do have we have on one of our matters, I have a call. But why don't we go ahead and head towards the close? Or
I was thinking
the tip of the day.
I do love the tip of the day. So, Dan, you've shared a lot of really good insights with us and really appreciate it. To round out the conversation, we'd love if you just gave us a soundbite snippet, 30 seconds to a minute, kind of like a punchy tip of the day.
Oh, man. Tip of the day.
What would you tell somebody, maybe it could even just be some of your basic spiel, this is what I have to tell everybody because they just...
Here's my tip of the day, which is almost the overlay to much of what we've talked about today. The tip of the day is remember that fundamentally in these businesses, in SaaS businesses, in non-SaaS businesses alike, people power performance. This brings us back to one of the first things you said, Omeed, but these businesses are just, collections of people. Not a product, people have to make the product. It's not a strategy, people have to develop the strategy. People drive these businesses. So the tip is approach that topic of how do we get the right who into the right where, focused on the right what. Approach the topic of how do we translate human potential and talent into business performance. Approach that with a needed level of intentionality. Approach that with a needed level of investment. Investment's not just hiring, but how do you raise your collective game within your firm, within your companies in getting great at attracting, decisioning around talent, retaining talent, developing and nurturing talent. That is Alpine's a good case study of this, but that is, I think, one of the most untapped advantages there is out there. And so go from paying lip service to that idea to actually thinking about how do we put our money where our mouth is and get great at that.
Thanks for that tip of the day, Dan, and thanks for joining us this week. It's been a real pleasure having you and all the insights that you shared with us. Go ahead and just move to close now. So everyone out there, thanks for joining us for another episode of the SaaS Buyers Club this week. I'm your host, Omeed.
And I'm your co-host, Joe.
And Dan Kremens, thanks again. Great to have you here.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for letting me into your world. And I enjoyed hearing your perspective on some of these topics and learned a thing or two from you about a lot of the things, not the least of which is meditation. You've gotten me thinking on that one.
So nice. Hey, it was awesome to have you on. And if we do a meditation podcast, we'll have you back on that one too.
I could be the before and after case study, hopefully at some point in the near future.
For sure. Well, awesome. So much you said today was so insightful in what you do and the topic in general. And I hope it brings listeners to have more of a focus on the employees in acquisitions and SaaS businesses as opposed just to the bottom line. So thanks again for coming today. We look forward to keeping in touch with you in the future.
And for everyone out there, if you want to get in touch with Dan, his contact info will be in the show notes. You'll be able to reach him that way. And make sure to follow, subscribe, like, and comment. And we'll see you next week.